Some countries just start out luckier than others, whether through geography or historical circumstance. However, what really determines a nation's success in the long term is decisions it makes, and this is a video about 3 countries over the course of the 20th century that really undershot their potential. We're going to look at what decisions these countries made wrong, and if they hadn't made those decisions, how would those countries and the world in general have turned out differently? In some ways, we'll see what are the factors that make countries rich in the first place, and what lessons we can apply for the future. Hi, I'm Rudyard, the guy behind What If Altists, and I'd like to briefly bring you this message. Japan's one of the richest countries in the world and has a tradition of craftsmanship that goes back centuries as well. You can partake in part of this tradition with Kamakoto. Kamakoto provides knives that are 100% Japanese steel, and with methods that date back to the Edo period for their manufacturing. These aren't machine-made, but are knives that are made by actual blacksmiths to be works of art and also extremely efficient. Each blade's individually inspected and also comes with a lifetime guarantee, making these really beautiful and efficient investments. These blades come in a beautiful ashwood box and also have a whetstone that you can use to keep the blades sharp across their whole lives. Kamakoto knives are so good that they're used by top-tier chefs, and these are the best knives that I've seen in my own life, to be honest. Why don't you spice up your kitchen with some beautiful and efficient stuff from Kamakoto? As a special Valentine's Day sale for this fan base, if you use the link in the description, you can get $50 off the Kamakoto website. Start cooking with beauty today. Number 1. Argentina. Many people often find it surprising that Argentina before the First World War was one of the wealthiest nations in the world. It was wealthier than France and up there with the US and Canada. Argentina was one of the biggest agricultural exporters in the world and was called a future titan of the Latin nations. Most people put it in the same camp as the USA, a majority white American nation destined for greatness. Over the 20th century, the US and Argentina, starting in very similar places, went down very different trajectories. The US rose to become half of the world's economy in 1945, and also the world's hegemon, spawning technological revolutions and the highest standard of living in the world for a good time. Argentina, meanwhile, went down the opposite trajectory. They averaged hyperinflation every 11 years or so, sinking into further and further poverty. Argentina is practically a joke among investors now as a country that will automatically screw things up. So the question here is, what went wrong in Argentina's trajectory, and how could it have been different? Argentina is a great argument against both that geography determines history and economic ability and the racist genetic superiority of white people. This is since Argentina is a nation with perfect geography, some of the most fertile soil in the world, a temperate climate, and a navigable river system that makes transport easy. Secondly, that Argentina is whiter than the US or Canada, with Italian and Spanish ancestry predominating. The thing that we see that made Argentina fail so hard was largely the same stuff that hurt the rest of Latin America, which I cover extensively in this video. But it largely boils down to landowners being able to constrict economic development by monopolizing control of the economy, combined with government corruption. These were problems that plagued all of Latin America, but you do see other Latin American countries that were far more successful than Argentina turned out to be, such as Costa Rica and Chile, which Argentina could have either matched or easily surpassed. Costa Rica and Chile both suffered from instability, coups, and corruption like any other Latin American country, but they were able to break out of that by decisions made by their elites that respected the rule of law and democracy. The place where we need to change Argentina's development is that in the 1930s, due to World War I and the Great Depression, agricultural prices collapsed. And since Argentina's economy was heavily dependent upon agriculture, it resulted in mass social instability. The key choice that was made in Argentina was that the ruling class supported the rise of the military, followed by basically fascist dictatorships, rather than democracy like they did in Chile. This dictatorial system, with Perón as its head, was a weird clientelistic, factional system of various interests in Argentine society, like landowners, labor unions, etc., and it favored various isolationist and corrupt economic policies that drove Argentina into economic decline. Argentina doesn't even have to be democratic in this world. In fact, corruption is more often lowered by harsh authoritarian dictators such as in Taiwan, Korea, Turkey, or Tanzania than in democratic societies. The only thing that Argentina would need would be a couple decades of fiscal discipline over the interwar period of not allowing corrupt monopolies to develop in Argentine society. Also not going too hard inflating the currency either. They would have to take a path similar to what Spain did once it joined the European Union in our world. I know this is sort of intangible and vague, but if Argentina took this path, it would have put itself in the same economic bracket as Chile, Spain, Uruguay, or Italy, all countries that it shares a great deal of culture with. Argentina's good geography, natural resources, and the like would have pushed it to wealth. Argentina would be a wealthy first-world country in this world. There are two things Argentina could do to push itself into an even higher bracket. All the countries above that Argentina shares culture with are all modern but not industrial, and share corruption, oversized welfare states, and corrupt politics. Argentina would have to do something no other Latin nation has ever done by breaking out of that basket, but I'm not saying it can't be done. Secondly, Argentina would probably still go through the 1970s period of military dictatorship that basically every other country in Latin America did. However, if they were lucky like Chile, they would use their better historical precedent to have an economically smart government like Chile's, which would catapult them into further wealth unlike our timeline's irresponsible government. Number 2. Malaysia. When the British were decolonizing Southeast Asia, there were a couple decisive choices that determined the history of the whole region. The most important of which is that they decided to split majority Han Chinese Singapore from majority Malay Malaysia. In this timeline, Singapore and Malaysia remain the same country, rather than splitting like they did in our world. The Malays are the native inhabitants, and the Chinese largely immigrants who came over in the 19th and early 20th centuries to populate the towns that the British built in the region. The Chinese are called the Jews of the East in that they're the predominant merchant classes, often controlling vast parts of the economy, while being small parts of the population. In modern Malaysia's case, the Chinese are 22% of the population, but 81% of the economy. This isn't the product of institutional oppression, in that the Chinese are horribly oppressed by local governments across Southeast Asia, or greater original wealth, in that most Chinese largely came in poverty into jungle regions with no institutions there beforehand. As an example, HSBC, or Hong Kong Singapore Bank, one of the largest banks in the world, basically started out as a shack in the jungle. The Chinese had advantages that came from coming from a culture that had centuries more experience with modern capitalist society, whether with literacy, a culture of hard work, or understanding of buying and selling. Meanwhile, the local Malaysians were still on a largely tribal level, with their first encounters of the modern world being working on the British's rubber plantations. When we see the different paths of Chinese-dominated Singapore and Malay-dominated Malaysia, the economic differences are stunning. Singapore is now one of the wealthiest places in the whole world, largely through pursuing pro-capitalist policies, and Malaysia is significantly poorer, with a policy of oppressing and putting restrictions on the Chinese merchant class, which is largely killing the goose that lays the golden egg, alongside larger corruption and ineffectiveness. Thus, we see the widely different effects of different cultures right next to each other. In our timeline, the Chinese and Malaysia largely went for communism, forming a guerrilla war against the British that took years to fight before the British gave Malaysia independence. Instead, in this world, the Malaysian Chinese community remains capitalist rather than going for communism, like it did in Singapore largely. The important fact here is that if you combine Singapore and Malaysia, the Chinese would have outnumbered the Malays. What then happens is that the Chinese communities in Malaysia and Singapore cooperate as a single unit more effectively. In our world, when the British gave Malaysia independence, the anti-communist local Malays had the power, and they split off from Chinese Singapore. However, in this world, the cooperation between the Singaporean and Malaysian Chinese, which wouldn't have been weakened by years of war with the British, they would make drive for total power over the region. This is pretty similar to what occurred in Israel and Palestine, in which the British imported one foreign ethnic group that was much better organized to one of their colonies, and so when the British pulled out, it meant a nasty civil war, with a better organized population, in this case the Chinese, winning. The important factor here is that the leader of Singapore in our world, and who almost certainly would have become the leader of a united Chinese Malaysia, Lee Kuan Yew, was possibly the greatest leader of the century. He led Singapore from a poor third-world nation to one of the wealthiest in the whole world, through incredible economic policies and wise leadership. In this timeline, with Lee able to play with a larger region, Malaysia would have become a very wealthy area, on par with other Sinic nations like Taiwan, Japan, or South Korea. Modern Singapore is what you could describe as an enlightened despotism, in that there are very few freedoms and it's not a real democracy. However, at the same time, society is extremely effective and fair. One of my friends described it as Disneyland under martial law. This would actually work out well for them in a certain regard, in that the Malaysians, due to their higher birth rate, would surpass the Chinese in number after a couple decades. However, power would be tightly held by Lee's Chinese oligarchy, and since it wouldn't be a democracy like Israel, exact population numbers wouldn't matter that much. After China would open up its borders after the end of Maoism, Malaysia would heavily recruit from mainland China for immigrants, which would probably tilt the ethnic balance back in the Chinese's favor. Speaking of Communist China, Malaysia would have two big enemies. The first would be Communist China, with which it would have a complex relationship in which, like Taiwan, there would be a tremendous amount of trade and immigration between them, but on a political basis, Malaysia would be a representative of another trajectory of Chinese civilization, independent from the CCP, and so would be treated as a threat. For this reason, just like our world, Malaysia/Singapore would be a strong American ally. The other main rival would be the Islamic world, in that the Chinese's probable pseudo-apartheid treatment of the native Malay population would result in denunciation from the rest of the Muslim world, which would treat Malaysia almost like a Far Eastern Israel. Expect lots of terror attacks in Malaysia for this reason. And Russia. I've talked about this one a couple different times on this show. If you look at the trajectory Russia was on before it turned communist, it was headed on a very different direction than the Russia we see today. Leftist historians have launched a purposeful propaganda campaign to make Tsarist Russia look like some economic backwater, but the reality is the opposite. Tsarist Russia was actually pretty similar to modern India, in that a recent industrial and technological revolution had made the nation far richer and better developed, but its results were spread unequally and the social tensions that came from industrialization were largely mismanaged. However, Russia's fundamentals were really good. It was having massive industrial growth, with one of the biggest reasons for the First World War being that Germany knew that if it didn't fight a war now, it would lose to developing Russia. Russia was a massive agricultural powerhouse, feeding much of Europe with incredible population growth and a birth rate of 7 children per woman. Russia was a cultural powerhouse as well, being on the cutting edge of literature, art, philosophy, and painting. When you compare it to the Soviet and post-Soviet Russia that followed, the results are just utterly soul-crushing. For an example, pre-communist Russia was a massive region of foreign investment. Well, in modern Russia, there's more Russian currency in banks outside Russia than inside it. Russia's birth rate collapsed from 7 children per woman mentioned above to beneath 2 or replacement level in the 1970s. For a comparison, the United States went from 3.5 children per woman in 1900 to 2.4 during the same era, ending in 1970, while wealthier and more urban countries like the US normally have lower birth rates. Russia went from being Europe's breadbasket before World War I to by the 1960s importing grain from America. The Soviets often get glory for industrializing Russia, and yes, the majority of Russia's industrialization did occur under them, but the Soviets did it in such a way as to gut Russia's prospects as a society. Under the Tsars and capitalism, you saw incredible advances in efficiency and productivity, which you didn't see under the communists, since communism creates no incentives towards efficiency or taking risks, only against screwing up and covering your ass to social superiors. The Soviets industrialized by just shoving more stuff through a stagnating degree of efficiency, which is why you saw such horrible environmental degradation under them, between the drying up of the Aral Sea, never colonizing Siberia effectively, or destroying the fertility of the Kazakh steppe. Likewise, the Soviets prioritized heavy industry like steel or tanks, but not light industry like commercial goods such as lawn chairs, toasters, or cars. If I had to summarize what the communists did worse, it was killing the most productive classes. For whatever reason, societies tend to be pretty Pareto principle driven, in that 20% of whatever group normally does 80% of the output. And the Soviets, as an almost social experiment, went about killing the most productive elements in the military, agriculture, business, literature, and science, and then creating no incentives towards quality or productivity. And I mean, this really shouldn't come as a surprise when we see communism failing everywhere else, whether comparing Chile to Cuba, Colombia to Venezuela, Kenya to Tanzania, East and West Germany, Taiwan and China, or North and South Korea. The big difference between Russia and most other places that had communism is that the Soviet Union remained communist for a far longer period of time, while most communist nations were only communist for about a generation, meaning that skills and knowledge of the market survived, while in Russia there was no living memory of capitalism when the Soviet Union fell. That meant that when communism fell, there was no capitalism that could replace it, and so Russia was stuck in this kind of traumatic middle position between state economy and healthy capitalism, kind of getting the worst of both, which is why Russia is so poor today. In this world, the whites win the Russian Civil War, and Russia either becomes a monarchy, fascist, or democratic state, or some combination of those. All of these would respect the economy better than the communists, however. This alternate history could go in a lot of directions, especially changing up the Cold War and World War II, and I'm not going to go into all the details here, but this is just a video I've done on that topic. Russia has some of the smartest and most talented people in the world, as well as some of the richest minerals and most fertile soil, with plenty of open space, meaning that if given a chance, it would be one of the richest and largest economies in the world. In this video, I choose to focus on 3 countries. However, I'm sure you could find more. I narrowly cut out South Africa off the list, for example. In the comments, write what countries you think had immense economic potential that was never realized. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my social media, the link to which are in the description, or my Patreon, where we've got the first couple hundred pages of my cultural history of America, history of the world, and as always, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.